There is an interstate in downtown Detroit that is barely more than a mile long. It's called I-375, and it is one of the shortest interstates in the United States. Driving it end to end takes about a minute. Thousands of people make that drive every day, and almost none of them know what is underneath the pavement. Underneath the pavement is a neighborhood, or what's left of one, which is nothing at all. No foundations, no plaques, no outline of the old streets. There was a place here called Black Bottom, and beside it, an entertainment district called Paradise Valley, and together they were the beating heart of Black Detroit. People called it the Harlem of the West. A street named Hastings ran through the middle of it like a spine. Churches, nightclubs, pharmacies, funeral homes, barbershops, hundreds of Black-owned businesses packed shoulder to shoulder for block after block. Some of the greatest musicians of the 20th century played the rooms on that street. Doctors delivered babies there. Preachers built congregations there. Families who had escaped the worst of the Jim Crow South built entire lives there. And the city of Detroit wiped it off the map, on purpose, with paperwork. But here is the part that makes this story dark, and not just sad. The people of Black Bottom did not choose to crowd into those blocks. Detroit forced them there. For decades, the city, its banks, and its real estate industry built an invisible wall around the neighborhood and made it nearly impossible for a Black family to live anywhere else in town. And then, once the trap had filled with people, roughly 350,000 of them caught in its machinery over the years, the city looked at the overcrowding it had engineered, pointed at it, and called it a slum. It condemned the neighborhood under federal law. It evicted the residents. It bulldozed their homes, their businesses, their churches, and on the cleared ground, it built a freeway and a gleaming modern development that almost none of the old residents could afford. This is the dark story of how Detroit trapped 350,000 people in Black Bottom and then erased the only place they were allowed to live. The name came first, and it had nothing to do with the people. French settlers named this low-lying stretch of land near the Detroit River for its soil, dark, damp, and almost absurdly fertile. Black Bottom. For generations it was farmland, and then it became what every industrial city had, a landing place. The neighborhood sat on the near east side, just beyond downtown, close to the factories and the docks. The houses were old even then, wooden frame homes thrown up quickly in the 19th century, packed close together on narrow lots. German immigrants lived there, and Irish and Eastern European Jewish families, each wave arriving poor, working, saving, and moving up and out. That was the deal. Black Bottom was the first rung on the ladder. You were not supposed to stay. And for the white immigrants who passed through, the ladder worked exactly as promised. Then the Great Migration began, and Detroit quietly changed the rules. In the years around the First World War, Black families began leaving the American South by the tens of thousands. They were fleeing lynch mobs, sharecropping debts that could never be paid off, and the daily grind of Jim Crow. And they were moving towards something specific: wages. Detroit's factories were roaring. Henry Ford was famously offering $5 a day, a number that seemed almost fictional to a man working someone else's cotton field. Word spread through letters, through Black newspapers passed hand to hand, through porters on the trains. A man could earn more in a week on an assembly line than in a month behind a mule. So they packed what they could carry, and they came north. Between the beginning of that migration and the Great Depression, Detroit's Black population exploded, from a few thousand people to well over 100,000 in roughly 2 decades. They arrived in a city that wanted their labor and absolutely nothing else. When a Black auto worker cashed his paycheck and went looking for a house, he discovered that most of Detroit was simply closed to him. Deed after deed carried restrictive covenants, clauses written directly into property titles barring sale or rental to anyone who wasn't white. Real estate agents would not show him listings outside a few designated areas. Banks would not write him a mortgage in a white neighborhood, and federal lending maps would later shade the neighborhoods he could live in as hazardous, redlined, unfit for investment. Homeowners associations organized specifically to keep him out. None of this was hidden. It was policy, printed and signed. Nearly the entire tide of the Great Migration was funneled into a handful of overflowing districts, and the largest of them was Black Bottom. And when paperwork failed, the wall was enforced the old-fashioned way. In 1925, a black physician named Ossian Sweet bought a modest house in a white neighborhood on Detroit's east side. He had seen mob violence before, and he arrived expecting it. He brought friends, and he brought guns. On his second night in the house, a crowd gathered outside, and stones began hitting the walls and windows. Shots were fired from inside the house, and a white man in the crowd was killed. Sweet, his family, and his friends were put on trial for murder, defended famously by Clarence Darrow. Eventually, they went free, but the message Detroit's black residents took from the whole affair was hard to miss. The wall around Black Bottom was not just made of deeds and bank policies. Test it, and you could find a mob on your lawn. Test it, and you could end up on trial for surviving. Inside the wall, the arithmetic did its work. The neighborhood could not grow outward, so it compressed. Landlords, many of them absentee, carved single-family houses into rooming houses, then carved the rooms themselves into halves. Families doubled up, then tripled up. And because the captive market had nowhere else to go, rents inside Black Bottom ran higher than in white neighborhoods with far better housing. Worse housing, higher price. The trap even collected a toll. Meanwhile, the city withheld the basics. Streets went unrepaired, garbage sat uncollected, aging buildings went uninspected, and the housing codes that were strictly enforced elsewhere were quietly ignored here. Remember that neglect. Detroit starved this neighborhood of every service a city provides, watched it wear down under impossible crowding, and then, years later, would point at the wear and the crowding and call them proof of something rotten in the people themselves. Here is what the city never expected. Inside that wall, penned in and price gouged and ignored, the people of Black Bottom built one of the most vibrant black communities in America. Because the trap had a strange side effect. Everything had to exist inside it. Black Detroiters could not eat in most downtown restaurants, could not stay in most hotels, could not be treated in most hospitals, often could not even be buried by white funeral homes. So the neighborhood built its own everything. By the 1940s, the district held hundreds of black-owned businesses: groceries, tailors, drugstores, print shops, beauty parlors, restaurants, insurance offices, hotels, theaters. $1 earned in the factories could pass through a dozen black-owned hands before it left the neighborhood. Hastings Street, the commercial spine, ran thick with commerce from morning until long after midnight. It was a full society, not just a shopping strip. Black doctors, barred from practicing in white hospitals, founded their own clinics and hospitals inside the neighborhood. Black lawyers hung shingles. Black newspapers reported the news the white dailies ignored. The churches were the anchor of all of it. Some of the massive congregations that fed the hungry, banked the unbankable, and organized the community's political voice. Fraternal lodges, women's clubs, credit circles, baseball teams. For a family that had left a Mississippi cotton town where a black man could be killed for registering to vote, walking down Hastings Street was like stepping onto another planet, one where the mayor of your block, the man in the finest suit, the owner of the building, could look like you. And then there was the music. On the neighborhood's northern edge sat Paradise Valley, the entertainment district. Block after block of nightclubs, ballrooms, and theaters, most of them black-owned. This is the part of the story people would later put on postcards. The reason for the nickname, the Harlem of the West. The biggest names in Black American music came through Paradise Valley. When they came through Detroit, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, the great swing orchestras, and the great blues shouters. On a good Saturday night, the valley glowed. White Detroiters, the same ones who would never let a black family onto their street, drove in to hear the bands. The Trap, it turned out, had built one of the best nights out in the Midwest. Down on Hastings Street itself, the sound was rawer. This was blues territory. Storefront record shops, corner joints, guitars running through cheap amplifiers. A young John Lee Hooker, who had come up from the South to work Detroit's factories like everyone else, played these rooms. And when he cut Boogie Chillin', one of the biggest blues records of its era, the song name-checked Hastings Street itself. The street was famous enough to put in a lyric. People from Black Bottom carried that as a point of pride. Their street, their sound, pressed into records that sold across the country. The neighborhood raised more than musicians. Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion of the world, for a time maybe the most famous black man in America, grew up in this part of Detroit after his family came north from Alabama. Della Reese sang in its church choirs as a girl. A young Coleman Young came up through these same streets, and he would carry what he saw there, the talent, the confinement, the injustice, all the way to the mayor's office, though not for decades yet. Ask the elders who lived in Black Bottom, and they will tell you the same two things, and they will tell you both are true. It was poor, and the buildings were old, and the landlords were thieves. And it was home, dense, loud, self-sufficient, and theirs. That is what makes what happened next so bitter. Black Bottom was not a failed place. It was a strangled place that succeeded anyway. Its people had done the impossible, locked inside a wall, denied loans, denied services, denied space. They had built a functioning economy and a culture famous enough to draw the whole city to its doors. If the wall had come down, if those families had been allowed to buy, borrow, and build like their white co-workers, there is no telling what the neighborhood could have become. Instead, City Hall was about to study those crowded blocks, those worn wooden houses it had refused to service for 30 years, and reach for a new word. Not neglected, not segregated. The word was slum. The Second World War tightened the trap to its breaking point. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. Its factories converted to tanks and bombers, its wages pulling in yet another enormous wave of Southern migrants, black and white. The white workers spread out across the city and its new suburbs. The black workers were pressed into the same few districts as always, and Black Bottom swelled past anything the old housing stock could bear. When the government tried to open a single federal housing project to black war workers, the Sojourner Truth Homes, in 1942, white crowds attacked the families as they tried to move in. It took police escorts to get black tenants into homes their own government had built for them. That was the housing market Black Detroit lived in. Even a war for democracy could not crack the wall. A year later, the pressure exploded. In June of 1943, fighting between black and white Detroiters broke out at Belle Isle, the island park on the river, and spread into days of citywide violence. Federal troops were sent in to stop it. When it was over, 34 people were dead, most of them black, and many of those killed by the police themselves. White mobs had dragged black riders off streetcars on Woodward Avenue while officers looked on. The riot told the truth about Detroit in blood. Two populations, one city, and a wall between them that was becoming unbearable. City leaders studied what had happened, and the lesson too many of them drew was not that Black Detroit needed more room, more housing, more justice. It was that the crowded black district downtown was a problem, a dangerous, embarrassing, valuable piece of land sitting right next to the city's front door. The planners already had a word ready. For years, city documents had described Black Bottom's aging blocks as blighted. a word borrowed from plant disease, as if poverty were a fungus that infected real estate. Blight sounded scientific. Blight sounded like nobody's fault. It certainly didn't sound like what it was: the predictable result of redlining, rent gouging, and municipal neglect, compounded over 30 years. In 1946, the city made its intentions official, unveiling a program to acquire and clear the district's blighted acres and offer them up for redevelopment. The maps were drawn. The oldest black neighborhood in Detroit, the one place its people had been permitted to root themselves, was now, on paper, a disease to be cut out. What the city needed was money and legal cover. And in 1949, Washington delivered both. The Federal Housing Act of that year created what came to be called urban renewal. The government would help cities buy up slumland through eminent domain, level it, and hand it to developers to build something new. On paper, it promised a decent home for every American family. In practice, cities across the country aimed the program with remarkable consistency at black neighborhoods, at exactly the districts that segregation had made crowded and disinvestment had made shabby. James Baldwin would later say it plainly. Urban renewal, he said, meant Detroit did not invent the machine, but few cities would run it harder, and Black Bottom was standing directly in its path. Notice what the law did not require. It did not require the city to ask whether the crowding it called blight was the city's own creation. It did not require anyone to count the businesses that would be destroyed, or to compensate their owners for customer bases built over decades. And its obligations to rehouse the displaced were thin promises with no real teeth. Condemnation worked on a simple, brutal appraisal logic. The city paid what it judged the property to be worth. And who had set that worth? The same banks and federal maps that had redlined the neighborhood for years, branding it hazardous and starving it of loans. First, the system marked the land as nearly worthless. Then, the system bought it at the price the marking had produced. The trap did not just take the neighborhood, it set the price of the neighborhood before it took it. So the sequence was complete, and it is worth saying out loud, because each step was legal and each step was public. Detroit confined its black citizens to one aging district and barred every exit. It refused that district the loans, repairs, and services that keep a neighborhood healthy. It watched the confinement produce overcrowding and decay, then labeled the result a slum, as though the people were the cause. And then it obtained federal money to erase the slum it had manufactured. Residents began hearing the news, the way you hear a far-off train. Rumors in the barber shop, notices in the paper, surveyors on the sidewalk with clipboards. The letters came after that. The city was coming, and it was not bringing help. It was bringing an appraisal. The clearing began at the start of the 1950s, and it proceeded the way these things always proceed: politely, bureaucratically, and completely. Condemnation notices went out block by block. Renters, who were most of the neighborhood, were given deadlines and little else. Homeowners were offered the city's price, and the city's price was rooted in those redlined valuations, often enough to extinguish a family's stake, rarely enough to buy in a black accessible neighborhood of equal quality, if such a place could even be found. Some fought in court and learned how eminent domain works. You can argue about the price, but not really about the taking. The churches held their last services. The shopkeepers held their liquidation sales. And family by family, the neighborhood that had taken 40 years to build began emptying out on a government schedule. Then the machines came, and they were thorough. Houses first, in long rows. The wrecking crews could take down a block of those old wooden homes with astonishing speed. Then the brick storefronts, the lodge halls, the churches whose cornerstones had been laid with parades. Hundreds of businesses went under the treads, and here the losses went far beyond brick. A business is a location, a reputation, a web of customers who know where to find you. None of that survives demolition, and none of it was compensated. A grocer or a funeral director who had spent 25 years building a clientele on Hastings Street did not reopen across town as the same business. Most never reopened at all. Urban renewal did not just demolish Black Detroit's housing. It demolished Black Detroit's economy, the largest concentration of Black-owned enterprise the city had ever seen, and called the demolition progress. And the darkest question of all was the simplest one. Where, exactly, were these people supposed to go? The wall that had trapped them in Black Bottom was still standing everywhere else. The covenants, the redlining, the hostile neighborhood associations, none of that had been demolished, only the neighborhood inside it. The law's relocation promises turned out to be nearly worthless in practice. Families were largely left to solve an unsolvable market on their own. Public housing had years-long waiting lists and its own color lines. So the displaced did the only thing possible. They pressed into the handful of other neighborhoods that would take them, doubling up all over again. The city had raised a crowded district in the name of ending overcrowding, and produced more overcrowding. The same trap, reassembled at new addresses. The bitterest proof of the city's priorities was the pace. Detroit was in a hurry to empty the land, and in no hurry at all to build anything on it. After the wreckers finished, whole tracts of cleared ground sat vacant for years, block after block of rubble and ragweed where a living neighborhood had been, waiting while developers and officials haggled over plans. Families who had been told their homes had to fall urgently for the city's future could drive past and watch weeds grow head-high on the graves of their houses, season after season. If the land had truly been needed, that would have been one kind of story. The vacant years told the real one. What had been urgent was not the building of the new thing. What had been urgent was the removal of the people. Something else was destroyed in those years. Harder to photograph than a building, but slower to heal. A neighborhood like Black Bottom is a living network. The church that knows your family, the neighbor who watches your children, the grocer who carries you on credit in a bad month, the 1,000 small dependencies that make poverty survivable and life meaningful. Scatter the people and the network dies, even though every individual person is still alive. Elders lost the streets that held their whole biography. Congregations that had taken generations to build followed their scattered members or dissolved. Ask the survivors, decades later, and they could still walk you down Hastings Street from memory. This corner, that stoop, this club, that church. The map survived in their heads, only in their heads. What rose on the cleared land tells you exactly who the clearing was for. On a large portion of Old Black Bottom, the city's redevelopment produced Lafayette Park, a serene modernist enclave of glass and steel towers and elegant courtyard townhouses designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, one of the most celebrated architects of the 20th century. Architecture critics admire it to this day. It would eventually be declared a National Historic Landmark, and it is genuinely beautiful. It was also, from the day it opened, aimed at a different class of resident entirely. Professionals and the comfortable middle class, people the city hoped to keep from fleeing to the suburbs. The families who had been bulldozed off that exact ground overwhelmingly could not afford the new rents. The city had not renewed their neighborhood for them. It had harvested their neighborhood and planted someone else's. Sit with that exchange for a moment, because it is the heart of this story. A poor but functioning Black district, hundreds of businesses, dozens of churches, a famous music scene, tens of thousands of residents, was traded for a low-density showpiece, housing a fraction of the number of people. The showpiece won awards. The district it replaced won nothing, because officially it had never been anything but blight. To this day, you can read glowing essays about the architecture of Lafayette Park that never once mention what stood on the land before. as if the towers had been lowered onto empty ground. That silence is not an accident. It is the final stage of urban renewal. First, the people are removed, then the buildings, and then, patiently, the memory. Hastings Street itself received a different monument. The spine of Black Detroit, the street from the blues records, the street of the pharmacies and the storefront churches, was chosen as the route for a new expressway. The street was erased with a completeness that is hard to comprehend, not renamed, not widened, but excavated, replaced by a sunken trench of concrete carrying the freeway that would be designated I-375. It opened in the mid-1960s. The road's core purpose was candid enough to speed commuters, increasingly white and increasingly suburban, between downtown and the neighborhoods and suburbs beyond. The city had taken the most storied Black Street in Michigan and turned it into a ditch for driving past the place where Black Detroit used to be. Detroit was not alone in this. In those same years, cities across America were routing their new interstates through Black neighborhoods with a consistency that no one even bothered to disguise. The land was cheap because the same governments had made it cheap, and the residents lacked the political power to stop it. Freeways gutted Black districts from coast to coast. But even in that grim national company, Detroit stands out for the sheer completeness of the act. The trap, the condemnation, the towers, and the trench, executed in a single generation, on a single neighborhood, with the paper trail intact. Nobody hid this. It was announced in press conferences and ribbon cuttings. The destruction of Black Bottom was not a scandal in its time. It was a civic achievement. Count the losses honestly, and the word renewal curdles. Homes taken at condemnation prices in the one era when working families, white ones, were building the greatest wave of home equity in American history. Businesses erased with their goodwill, their locations, their futures. A generation of Black wealth, the seed corn of the next generation, plowed under and paved. The families of Black Bottom were not merely moved, they were reset to zero and then handed the bill for the moving. White Detroit drove home on the new freeway. Black Detroit started over, again, inside the same wall as before, minus everything it had built the first time. Follow the scattered families, and the story leads somewhere every Detroiter knows. Great numbers of the displaced landed on the city's near west side, in and around the 12th Street corridor, which absorbed wave after wave of uprooted people until it was as overcrowded as Black Bottom had ever been. The old pressures, the old resentments, the old policing, all transplanted to a new address. In July of 1967, on 12th Street, police raided an after-hours club, and Detroit erupted into one of the deadliest urban uprisings in American history. 43 people were dead when it ended. No honest account of how that street reached its breaking point can leave out how so many of its people had come to be there, pushed off their old blocks by the bulldozers of urban renewal, carrying the fresh memory of a neighborhood the city had taken. Detroit changed after that. In 1973, Coleman Young, the kid from Black Bottom, was elected the city's first Black mayor, taking charge of a city the freeways were now emptying at speed. And the people of the vanished neighborhood did what dispossessed people do. They kept the place alive themselves. Reunions, decade after decade, oral histories, church anniversaries where the old congregations gathered far from their demolished sanctuaries. Ask them about Hastings Street and the years fall away. They can still tell you which corner sold the best barbecue and which club you had to be careful in. A city can bulldoze buildings. Memory is harder to condemn. And then, after 60 years, the concrete itself blinked. The freeway that replaced Hastings Street turned out to be as mortal as everything else. Aging, underused for an interstate, a mile-long trench severing downtown from its east side. In recent years, the state and the city announced plans, backed by federal money, to tear I-375 out and replace it with an ordinary street-level boulevard. And officials now say openly what their predecessors never would, that the freeway destroyed a black neighborhood, and that this was wrong. It is an extraordinary admission. It is also for the people of Black Bottom, 6 decades late. You can remove a freeway. You cannot remove it from the years it stood. The neighborhood it buried was supposed to last forever. The road that replaced it barely outlived the men who built it. So remember what actually happened here, in order, because the order is the crime. Detroit walled 350,000 people into Black Bottom and let them live nowhere else. They answered by building the Harlem of the West. The city starved it, labeled the starvation a slum, condemned it under federal law, bulldozed it, and scattered its people back into the same segregation, then put a freeway over the spine and a landmark over the grave. Nothing about it was secret, and almost none of it was illegal. That is the dark part. Somewhere under the concrete of that 1-mile interstate, the black soil that named the neighborhood is still there, the ground itself outlasting everything the city did on top of it. The people of Black Bottom always said the land was good. It was the city that failed it.